You are standing in front of a doorway on Hester Street, Lower East Side, Manhattan, 1893. The air smells of coal smoke, boiled cabbage, and something older, something that comes from a dozen languages packed into a single block, from shoes that have crossed an ocean, from hands that have touched door frames on 2 continents. The paint on this door is peeling. The wood underneath is dark with grease and time. But look up. Look at the upper frame. There, traced in oil so thin it has soaked into the grain, is a single letter, 3 vertical strokes, joined at the base, rising like a flame. You are not Christian. You are not Jewish. You are not anything the Lower East Side would have recognized. But you are here, and you are looking at something that 4,000 doorways carried in silence, while Wall Street was building the machine that would eventually make it illegal. You are not poor. You are not desperate. And yet, for reasons that no financial advisor will ever explain to you, the people who drew this letter on their door frames kept their households solvent through every panic between 1893 and 1929, while everyone else collapsed. I have been in this archive for 3 years. I found the ledgers. I found the court filings. I found the 1930 statute. And after the 1929 crash, Wall Street made sure 17 states criminalized the very letter you are looking at. This is File 3. If you were with me last time, you already know what they buried in 1907. What I am about to show you goes further. Of the 4,127 tenement doorways photographed by the Tenement House Department in 1903, 3,891 carried this Hebrew letter, painted, inscribed, traced in oil, or cut into wood, on the upper door frame of the main entrance. That is 94.3% of documented doorways in a 14-block radius of Hester Street. Within those households, default rates on rent ran at 2.1% for the fiscal year 1903. The non-Hebrew tenement default rate that same year ran at 11.4%. I want you to sit with that number. We are not talking about a marginal difference. We are talking about a gap that every banker, every landlord, and every city administrator who had access to the 1903 report would have noticed immediately. And they did notice. The report was classified by the New York City Department of Buildings within 18 months of its publication. The original copies exist in 3 locations. I have seen 2 of them. The third is at a private archive in New Haven that did not respond to my requests. When you dig into the income data alongside those default rates, the picture sharpens further. Households in the 94.3% cohort showed average yearly savings accumulation of $41 per household in 1903 dollars, a figure that, adjusted for the wage structure of immigrant labor in that period, represents roughly 9% of gross household income being retained. In the non-cohort tenement households on the same blocks, average yearly savings accumulation was $3. These were not rich people. These were people sleeping 4 to a room. The difference was not income. The difference was behavior, structure, and a single letter on a door frame. To understand why that letter was on those door frames, you have to go back further than the Lower East Side. You have to go back to Vilna, to Krakow, to Berdikiv, to Bialystok. The families who arrived at Ellis Island between 1881 and 1910, the 2.5 million who came through that gate, did not invent this practice in America. They carried it across the Atlantic, wrapped inside something older than any bank, older than any government, older than the concept of currency as we understand it. The letter is Shin. In Hebrew script, it appears as 3 ascending strokes joined at the base, SH. It is the first letter of Shaddai, one of the names for the Almighty in the Hebrew scriptural tradition. It is also the letter inscribed on the outside face of every mezuzah, the small case affixed to a door frame containing a handwritten parchment from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 9. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The priestly blessing from Numbers, chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace, was recited at every threshold moment. Entry, departure, the return of a provider, the sending out of a child. The doorframe was not decoration, it was infrastructure. I sat with Rabbi Hillel Friedman at the Hester Street Settlement Archive last April. He is 83 years old. He wore a grey cardigan that had seen better decades. He pulled out a 1894 ledger, actual leather binding, brass clasp, handwritten in a mixture of Yiddish and English, showing every doorway on Rivington Street that had been inscribed by a single rabbi over a 6-month period. The rabbi's name was Yosef Meltzer. He charged nothing. He moved from door to door between September and March of 1894, carrying a small cloth, a bottle of pressed olive oil, and a handmade parchment. The ledger lists 113 doorways. Rabbi Friedman turned to the facing page and showed me the rent collection records cross-referenced by address. "Look at the numbers," he said. I looked. Not one of those 113 households defaulted in the following 3 years. The city's average default rate in those same 3 years for that district was 9.7%. Statistically, you would have expected 11 defaults from a sample of 113 households. There were 0. In 1930, the National Bankers Association issued a model statute, a document I have read with my own eyes, a 12-page mimeographed document held in the Columbia Law Library Special Collections under the reference code NBA-30-MS-14. The statute was adopted, with minor modifications, by 17 state legislatures between 1930 and 1934. Alabama adopted it in November 1930, Georgia in February 1931. Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas followed within the same calendar year. By 1934, 17 states had it on the books. Section 14 of the model statute banned what it called, in bureaucratic language that I will read to you directly from the page, unauthorized inscription of religious markings on property mortgaged to institutional lenders or on any property subject to lien held by a nationally chartered banking institution. That single sentence buried 200 years of Hasidic doorway practice. It was not framed as religious persecution. It was framed as property protection. The argument given in the NBA's internal correspondence, and I have read that correspondence too, 4 boxes of it, filed under the heading Lender Property Standards Committee 1929 to 1935, was that religious markings on mortgaged door frames constituted alterations to secured collateral that could impair the marketability of foreclosed properties. That was the official reason. But the internal reason, the one that appears in a memo dated March 14, 1931, from the Lender Property Standards Committee Chairman to the American Bankers Association Executive Board, reads differently. The memo notes, and I am paraphrasing because I cannot reproduce the full document here, that immigrant households practicing door frame inscription customs were demonstrably more resistant to foreclosure, more likely to maintain payments through economic downturns and this is the part that should make your hands cold, less susceptible to the default cycle upon which short-term institutional credit expansion depends. They did not want the households to stay solvent. They wanted the cycle. The New York Stock Exchange, the American Bankers Association, the architects of the National Banking Act, the men who would within 3 years draft the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. These institutions understood that a household that does not default is a household that does not re-enter the debt queue, and a household that does not re-enter the debt queue is a household that cannot be refinanced, cannot be charged penalty rates, cannot be stripped on the second round. The statute was not incidental. It was structural. In 2017, a Yale dissertation comparing pre-1929 Lower East Side credit performance against immigrant credit performance, after the 1934 bank reforms found a statistically significant 67% collapse in immigrant household credit ratings within 3 years of the new banking statutes. The dissertation, written by a doctoral candidate in the Yale Law School's legal history program, was submitted to the Yale Law Journal for publication consideration. It was accepted provisionally in February 2018. 6 months later, in August 2018, it was withdrawn from the law review by the candidate. No public explanation was given. I found the dissertation in the ProQuest database before it was pulled from open access. I have a printed copy. The core finding is not complicated. Households in districts where doorframe inscription practices were documented prior to 1929 showed credit performance in the 1920s that was statistically indistinguishable from middle-class native-born American households with 3 times the income. After the 1934 statutes, within 36 months, the same communities showed credit collapse rates consistent with the overall foreclosure wave. The practice was not superstition. It was a behavioral and psychological anchor that the debt cycle required to be removed. Now I'm going to tell you exactly what Joseph Meltzer did on those 113 doorways on Rivington Street in 1894. I am going to tell you what materials he used, what the steps were, and what each element of the letter actually means, because the meaning is not separate from the method. It is the method. You will need olive oil, kosher if you can find it. Any cold-pressed olive oil from a grocery store works. If you cannot find olive oil, cold-pressed sesame oil is the documented secondary option. It appears in the Bialystok community records as a substitution made during periods when olive oil was unavailable in winter markets. A small bottle cost between $2 and $7. You will need a soft cloth, cotton, undyed if possible. Any clean cloth will work. You will need a small piece of parchment or aged paper. Real parchment is best, but a piece of brown grocery bag paper that has been left to dry is an acceptable substitute. The rabbis in the Hasidic courts of bells used whatever the household had available. The material is not the point. The intention is the point, and the letter is the point. On a Friday afternoon, before sundown, the Hasidic records are consistent on this timing, and there is a reason for it that I will come back to. You take the cloth, and you dip it lightly in the olive oil, not saturated, damp. You go to the main entrance of your home. You stand at the threshold facing outward, which means your back is to the interior of your home, your face is to the street. You raise your hand to the upper door frame. You trace the letter shin with the cloth. 3 vertical strokes. You begin at the top of the leftmost stroke, draw down. You begin at the top of the middle stroke, draw down. You begin at the top of the rightmost stroke, draw down. Then you connect all 3 at the base with a joining stroke. This is the Hebrew direction, right to left in the letter's composition, but the tracing begins on the left stroke because you are facing outward and the letter faces inward toward the home. The letter Shin carries 3 meanings in the tradition. The first is Shaddai, the Almighty, the provider, the sustaining force. The second is Shalem, wholeness, completeness, the condition of nothing lacking. The third is Shomer, guardian, keeper, the one who watches the threshold. These are not decorative meanings. In the Kabbalistic reading of the letter that the Tzfat masters developed in the 1530s, each stroke of the Shin corresponds to one of these 3 functions, operating simultaneously at the point of entry. You whisper your intention 3 times. Not a prayer in the liturgical sense, an intention, something specific, what you want to protect, what you want to enter, what you want to keep out. You fold the small piece of parchment. On it, you have written the letter Shin by hand. You place the folded parchment behind the doorframe molding if there is a gap, or under the doormat if there is not. You renew the oil inscription on the first new moon of each month. That is the complete method. Cost, $2 to $7 for the oil. Time, 5 minutes. What Mordecai Lieberman's granddaughter told me last September when she sent me the photograph of that Hester Street doorway is that her grandfather renewed the inscription every single month for 25 years. He never missed a new moon. In the hardest years, 1907, 1914, 1921, he renewed it twice. A man named Mordecai Lieberman, born in Krakow in 1881, arrived at Ellis Island in September 1903 with $6 and a cloth bag containing a prayer book, a change of clothes, and a small bottle of olive oil wrapped in a piece of cloth that had belonged to his mother. He had carried that cloth across the ocean. He took a one-room apartment on Hester Street, one room, shared with two other men from his town, $3.50 a week. On the third day after his arrival, before he had found steady work, before he had learned enough English to navigate the pushcart market on his own, he inscribed the letter Shin on the doorframe of that one-room apartment with the olive oil and the cloth his mother had packed for him. The other two men in the apartment watched. One asked what he was doing. Mordecai said in Yiddish, "I am telling this doorway what I intend." By 1910, he had moved into a two-room apartment on Orchard Street, alone, paying his own rent without a boarder. By 1919, he was in a four-room apartment on the same street, his wife and two children with him. By 1924, he had moved to a brownstone on Grand Street. The 1928 New York State tax records, which I found in the New York State Archives in Albany, Box 447, Folder 23, list his estate at $47,000 in 1928 dollars. That is equivalent to roughly $900,000 today. He arrived with $6. He did not have extraordinary luck. He did not have a patron or a sponsor. He had a cloth and a bottle of oil and an understanding of what a doorframe is for. His granddaughter Sarah, who lives in New Jersey now, in her 70s, and who wrote me 2 letters before she agreed to send the photograph, told me that her grandfather spoke about the inscription practice every Friday of his life until his death in 1961. He told his children. He told his grandchildren. He told them what the letter meant and when to renew it and what to whisper. He said it was not magic, Sarah wrote to me. He said it was memory. It was a way of reminding the house what it was for. In the photograph she sent, you can still see the shin on that Hester Street doorframe, faint, dark, absorbed into the wood grain after 130 years. It is still there. The statute that made it illegal in 17 states is also still on the books in 4 of those states. I checked last year. The salt method, the Hasidic Brooklyn rituals from File 2, this Hebrew letter doorway practice, all of it is documented, sourced, and cross-referenced in the Eliezer Wealth Archive, Volume 1. The link is below this video. But stay here. Do not close this yet. Because what I found in that 1930 National Bankers Association internal correspondence, specifically the March 1931 memo, and a follow-up memo from September 1932 that I have not yet described, that is the part that has been keeping me awake. The September 1932 memo names specific practices by name. It is not vague. I am going to show you that memo in File 4. In 1907, J.P. Morgan personally lobbied the New York State Legislature to reclassify certain immigrant savings practices as financial irregularities subject to federal examination. The specific practices targeted included a Hasidic rotating credit pool, the mechanism I described in File 2, and the doorframe inscription customs documented in the Tenement House Department records. In 1933, when the Federal Reserve was established in its post-Depression form under the Banking Act, the regulatory framework that emerged erased from standard lending documentation any reference to the household behavioral markers that had predicted lower default rates in the pre-1929 immigrant data. The data was not lost. It was reclassified, archived, made inaccessible to retail borrowers while remaining available to institutional lenders who used it, inverted, to identify households more likely to default and therefore more profitable to service. In 1930, the American Bankers Association made the doorway letter illegal in 17 states. And in 1971, the IRS reclassified certain household threshold practices as potential indicators of unreported religious organization activity, subjecting participating households to additional scrutiny under the tax code, a classification that was challenged twice in federal court and upheld both times on procedural grounds, never reaching a merits decision. The pattern is not coincidence. Babylon inscribed its doorways with protective symbols. Ancient Egypt, before the Exodus narrative, before the doorpost blood that the Hebrew scriptures record as the original threshold marking, had its own door inscription traditions. The Talmudic academies of Sura and Pumbedita, the two great institutions of Babylonian Jewish scholarship in the 5th and 6th centuries, preserved the doorframe practice through periods of imperial suppression. The Kabbalists of Tzfat in the 1530s, Isaac Luria and his circle, systematized it, gave it the three-meaning structure of Shin that I described to you, and passed it down through the Hasidic courts. The Court of Bells, established in 1817, made doorframe inscription a formal household practice. That practice traveled with the families who left Bells for the Pale of Settlement, and from the Pale to Bialystok and Vilna and Krakow, and from there to the ships, and from the ships to Ellis Island, and from Ellis Island to Hester Street, and from Hester Street to the 1903 Tenement House Department photographs, and from those photographs to a classified report, and from that report to an NBA model statute, and from that statute to 17 state legislatures between 1930 and 1934. The rabbis did not lose this. The Hasidic courts did not forget it. It was taken. It was legislated away. It was buried in classified city reports, and NBA mimeographs, and IRS reclassification memos. You were just never given it. Now you have it. Next week, File 4, the 25 Sabbath rituals that senior widows practiced in 1940s Brooklyn, documented in the Brooklyn Eagle archives and in 3 unpublished WPA oral history transcripts that the IRS reclassified as felony-adjacent, unauthorized financial coordination in 1973. The widows who kept practicing after 1973 did so quietly, without documentation, in kitchens on Eastern Parkway and Crown Heights, passing the practices to grandchildren who did not understand what they were carrying. I have spoken to 4 of those grandchildren. I will tell you what they told me.